Welcome back to the Daily Bible Breakdown. Today we're covering Leviticus chapters 23 through 25. Chapter 23 outlines for us the annual feast, these important celebrations that would be observed throughout Israel's history. The first is the Passover, followed by the Feast of Unleavened Bread. This was the 14th day of the first month, which is April for us, and then the following week. And this was specifically commemorating their deliverance from the death of the firstborn, that final plague there in Egypt, and the circumstances of their very swift departure, as they didn't have time to wait for their bread to leaven. And so they left with it unleavened. And so this would be how they would remember that miraculous deliverance. Then there's the Feast of Weeks, also called Pentecost. And this was to be observed 7 weeks and 1 day after the Feast of Unleavened Bread. That's 50 days. Hence the name Pentecost, which means 50th. This was to be a celebration of the provision of the harvest. Then there's the Feast of the Trumpets. Silver trumpets were actually to be sounded on the first day of every month, but on the first day of the 7th month in particular, it was especially significant, probably because it was signaling the nearing of the Day of Atonement. And that brings us to the next major celebration, which is the Day of Atonement, which happened on the 10th day of the 7th month. This was explained in great detail in chapter 16, so we won't reiterate that here. Lastly, there's the Feast of Tabernacles. This was the 15th day of the 7th month and continued for 7 days after that. And this was commemorating God's protection and provision in the wilderness where they lived in tents or tabernacles. For all of these occasions, no work was to be done as they honored and remembered these significant moments from their history. In chapter 24, we learn about the seriousness of the sin of blasphemy. Following some verses that give details of how they were to care for certain pieces of the tabernacle, like the lampstand and the table, we actually find a specific incident of blasphemy. And this is one of only 2 strictly narrative passages in the entire book of Leviticus. In this case, the son of an Israelite woman who had married an Egyptian got into an argument with another man and ended up blaspheming the name of God, cursing it in some way or using it in a curse. They awaited God's decision on the matter, and it was determined that he should be stoned for his sin, and that's what they did. In chapter 25, we find 2 more specific important occasions, the Sabbath year and the year of Jubilee. Every 7th year was considered the Sabbath year in which the land was to be left to rest. They weren't to do any reaping or harvesting that year. It's also during this time that all debts were canceled and slaves were released. This is important because later the children of Israel would be specifically punished for every year they did not observe the Sabbath year. Then every 50th year was the year of Jubilee. At this time, all land that was sold would be returned to the original owner, because in reality the land was the Lord's to begin with, and all Hebrew slaves were released. So these would be important parts of their history, still are important parts of their history to this very day. But it teaches us the lesson that we too should take time to reflect on what God has done for us and celebrate it and honor it in some way. That's all the time we have for today's Daily Bible Breakdown. We'll see you in the next episode.